Well, hello and welcome to today's National Soil Survey Center webinar, Dynamic Soil Properties and Soil Health, Opportunities for State and Soil Survey Collaboration. My name is Sean McVeigh, National Training Coordinator for the Soil and Plant Science Division, and I'm delighted to be your host today. This webinar is being recorded, and all participants joined the webinar in listen-only mode. You receive the webinar audio through your device's speakers. There is no telephone dial-in. If you are having audio difficulties, please check the various ways your computer speakers may be muted or have their volume set low, including the speaker adjustments available in the Adobe Connect interface. Be sure to turn up the volume if you need. You can maximize your webinar experience in Adobe Connect by shutting down Cisco AnyConnect and any of the programs that might compete for bandwidth. This includes email and, for the next few days, Skype for Business. Taking a look at our webinar room layout, Adobe Connect has content pods that include the featured presentation, the Q&A session, and the chat. Use the 4-arrow icon in the featured presentation pod to enter and exit the full screen view as you choose. We're here to answer your questions. To submit a comment or question for me or our presenter, use the Q&A pod and type in your question. I'll handle technical difficulties the best I can while hosting the webinar and interact with our presenters to answer your questions during the verbal Q&A period. I want to thank Jennifer Mason for being here to support our webinar and introduce our presenter. Jen, I'm going to turn the webinar over to you so you can introduce the topic and our presenter.
Thank you guys so much. Can everyone hear me? Hopefully you guys can hear me on the phone. Thank you so much for taking the time out to join us today to listen to Dee's presentation. Just a real quick bio on Dee before we get started. Dee received her Bachelor of Science in Arts in Environmental Soil Science from the University of Georgia and her Master's in Earth and Environmental Sciences, Paleoecology from Columbia University. Dee joined as an NRCS as a soil scientist in 2005. She spent 5 years mapping soils in 4 counties before becoming an ecological site specialist for Soil Survey Region 3. In that role, she was provided the opportunity to mesh her experiences with soils and landscapes with native plant communities and develop documents to achieve both agricultural and natural land uses. In 2016, Dee became the Assistant State Soil Scientist in Athens, Georgia, and some of her duties are disseminating soils information to both internal and external customers, conservation practice site assessments, developing and testing tools for conservation planning, and serving on a number of regional and national technical teams. She enjoys the time spent in the field. Most recently, she served on 2 details as the Acting State Soil Scientist in Tennessee and the National Resource Soil Scientist for Dynamic Soil Properties with the Plant and Soil Science Division. Before joining NRCS in 2005, Dee worked as a Senior Research Associate at the Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University, LDEO, in Palisades, New York. Paleoecological work focused on using pollen as an indicator for climate change, primarily using the historical record of the Hudson River Valley marshes. This was a continuation of her graduate work which culminated in a vegetation reconstruction for the past 1,500 years. Prior to grad school, she worked in the Environmental Geochemistry Lab at the LDEO, focusing on the measurement of heavy metal concentration and radionuclide dating of sediment from the Hudson River and greater New York City area. She was also responsible for managing air toxin studies in Los Angeles and New York City. While at LDEO, she worked in 2 oceanography labs, analyzing ocean water samples for helium and tritium isotopes, as well as chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs, used to track ocean circulation patterns. Her first professional position was at the Joseph W. Jones Ecological Research Center in Newton, Georgia, as a soils technician for an ecological site classification report. Sorry, I stumbled on that a little bit this afternoon. I must not have had enough coffee today. But with that, I'll introduce a good friend and colleague, Dee Peterson. Dee, I'm going to hand it off to you.
Thank you, Jen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's like Jen said, I appreciate everybody calling in this afternoon. A quick little synopsis of the first 3 questions. We have mostly Soil and Plant Science Division staff. At least the last time I checked, I can't see the Adobe Connect anymore. I just see my presentation. So about 66% Soil and Plant Science Division folks, 25% state. So and then the other categories are, less than that. And 38% very aware of DSPs and 36% aware but not really involved. So it seems like we've got some folks that already know what I'm going to say. So please stay awake for me and ask questions at the end. As Jen mentioned, I recently was detailed to the Soil and Plant Science Division as a National Resourceful Scientist working on dynamic soil properties, or DSPs. An April 2020 National Bulletin 430-20-7 outlined requirements for all MLRA soil survey offices to conduct at least one DSP project per year. And the purpose of my detail was to assist with accelerating and supporting those efforts with a focus on states. The intent of this webinar is to introduce the relevance of DSP projects to the agency mission and vision, discuss the DSP framework, outline and justify collaboration strategies, and hopefully engage state support. So first, how do DSP projects support the NRCS mission and vision? DSP projects assess differences in soil properties based on land use and management. These comparisons can give us an idea of the potential of a soil, not a comparison to an ideal soil. And discovering the potential that different soils can achieve will help landowners and conservation planners make land management decisions. By evaluating the effects of different management systems, including soil health management systems in the form of conservation practices, planners can improve the management recommendations that will help increase the health and function of soils on working lands in their area. Improved management implementation helps producers protect natural resources and contributes to all aspects of the agency vision. Healthy soils contribute to resilient landscapes and water quality. Conservation solutions are delivered and the agency mission is supported. You see how these things are relevant. Dynamic soil properties change with land use, management, or disturbance over the human time scale, which is decades to centuries, as opposed to inherent properties, which are more geologic in nature. And these data, collected by Soil and Plant Science Division staff, deliver scientifically defensible soil information to inform and support land management decisions for improved and sustained soil health and function. NRCS has defined soil health as the capacity of the soil to function as a vital living ecosystem that supports plants, animals, and humans. So you can see how the basic indicators of soil function shown in this slide here relate to soil properties. The relationships overlap, exhibiting the importance of property documentation. So if you just were to look at stability and support, for instance, then you'll note that the properties that influence that are A horizon thickness, soil organic carbon, pH, electrical conductivity, aggregate stability, bulk density, infiltration rate. And then if you said, okay, what about water relations? You've got some of the same properties that influence water relations: soil organic carbon, aggregate stability, bulk density, infiltration rate. The Soil and Plant Science Division conducts data collection and analysis to support conservation planning by delivering enhanced soil survey information. The main objective of DSP project data collection is to document ranges and central tendencies of DSPs for a given set of soils and land management conditions. So wouldn't your producers appreciate knowing how much a suite of management practices would affect the soil on their farm? Knowing how much improvement these systems can have is a major selling point to increasing soil health management system adoption. One task of my detail was to work with states on DSP efforts. And this is timely because states were required to update their soil health strategies in 2020. And I was on detail in Tennessee at that time and led the soil health strategy development. Luckily, the state had a robust soil health plan for the previous 5 years, so it was relatively easy for us to develop a new one. So during the Tennessee detail, I was able to highlight the similarities of soil health efforts in DSP projects and lay a framework for the 01 side and the 02 side to plan and achieve common goals related to soil health and DSP projects. And for the DSP detail, I performed a review of all those soil health strategies. And in September, the Soil Health Division released a summary document of those strategies too. And highlighted in their summary were some state goals of working DSP projects into normal soil health efforts. So it was heartening to see that there was at least some collaborative work starting. So now we'll discuss commonalities between DSP projects and soil health assessments. Shown here is the Cropland in-field soil health assessment worksheet. Most of the items assessed correspond to a routinely measured soil property. And so this slide shows the soil health assessment indicators again, and then the related soil survey or DSP measurement on the left-hand side. In addition to DSP measurements, the DSP project sampling collection methods include the completion of the state or national soil health assessments. So it's evident that DSP data collection aligns with the Soil Health Division soil health assessment. And if you just look at this comparison, most of the soil health assessment items are described by routine soil survey properties or measurements. The DSP management history questionnaire was compared to the management interview questions found in the recently released Soil Health Tech Note 45006, which is the Cropland In-Field Soil Health Assessment Guide. And they are very similar. You know, you're always interested in if there are common goals, if the things that are being assessed are similar too. So these interview questions and the questionnaire for DSPs are very similar. There are only a couple of items in the soil health interview questions that were not included in the DSP questionnaire. And in addition, there were a number of items assessed in the DSP landowner questionnaire that were not included in those soil health assessment interview questions. There are also optional measurements, which are standard for a full characterization data analysis obtained during some DSP sampling, not all, and those are nutrients, pH, electrical conductivity, and soil organic matter. Shown here is the cover of the NRCS Guide to Pasture Condition Scoring. Most items in here are related to vegetation kinds and amounts that can be included in the vegetation section of PEDON descriptions. And those of you who are well-versed in the ecological site world may hone in on that term vegetation kinds and amounts, because that's verbiage that is in the definition of ecological sites. Therefore, it's important to consider the dynamic soil properties as being part of ecological sites. Some items that can be observed as part of DSP projects are the plant residue and litter as soil cover, the grazing utilization and severity as described in the management questionnaire, soil compaction can be described, and then erosion. Those are all things that are mentioned in the pasture condition scoring guidance. In November 2019, the Soil Health Tech Note 450-3 provided information on recommended soil health indicators and associated lab procedures. It also includes needs for continued advancement of the agency's soil health priority, some of which can be addressed and fulfilled by the Soil and Plant Science Division and dynamic soil property projects. So these items are pertinent to standardization needs, goals, and limitations that are mentioned in this tech note. Standard soil characterization methods are acknowledged in the tech note as allowing for large-scale data integration and comparison. So this is the strength of soil survey methodology. Lab methods vary significantly and can hinder valid comparison of measurements and assessment of changes across space and time. Currently, there's work underway by SPSD under the umbrella of Science for Soil Health, or DSPs for Soil Health. Some of you may be involved in those, to compare lab methods. Purpose is to assess the repeatability and appropriate use of certain methods so that recommended analyses can be consistent. And then there is mention of the need for comparing samples across many ecosystems and management systems using common methodologies. Survey offices execute MLRA projects that are conducted across the landscape, which can incorporate multiple management systems and land uses as well. So here is a slide of the DSPs for soil health effort. There are currently a number of sites across the country. This is to compare the lab methods. The goal of these projects is to develop reference values of soil health indicators for general soil groups, assess the usefulness of soil health indicators in individual circumstances, link the research to soil databases, compare results across cooperator labs and KSSL. And some of the indicators that are measured are that field-based soil health assessment, infiltration, the PEDON description, soil organic carbon, aggregation, soil respiration, enzymes, permanganate oxidizable carbon, available organic nitrogen, and community structure. Some of the goals described in the Tech Note 450-03. The first purpose is to be included in conservation planning and in NRCS technical and financial assistance activities. So DSP information can provide quantitative data based on repeatable measurements and standard methods. Further attention and investment from collaborating partners. Who could be a better collaborating partner than another division in NRCS? And then the mechanism to maintain an up-to-date set of soil health measurement standards. National Bulletin 430-21-1 dated October 22nd references updated guidance on DSP project development and execution. One document describes acceptable methods for specific analyses, and this guidance is fluid and will evolve as needed based on recommendations and results of studies such as those of DSPs for soil health where the lab methods are being compared. The Tech Note highlights the need for a national data set. This is under the limitations heading in that Tech Note. And soil survey is a national data set. The need for a national data set which soil and climate-based interpretation development can occur. So soil DSP and soil health information can and should be integrated into that soil survey national data set. The Tech Note mentions variability based on things such as soil sampling depth. DSP projects require standard sampling depths for DSP measurements. And also mentioned the requirements for measurements on multiple 6-inch cores. Now, being a soil scientist, I see it being difficult to tie the upper 6 inches of the soil profile to the landscape. So soil survey dynamic soil property projects document the inherent soil properties of the entire soil profile. Soil map units with the same name soil components will be tied to the appropriate range of dynamic soil properties as collected and analyzed through these DSP projects. So that whole idea of tying these ranges of dynamic soil properties to the landscape and creating this large national data set, just keep that in mind. It's one of the goals. There's a very subtle but very important point that needs to be made, and some people, if you've been on other talks that I've given on this, you may have seen this slide. I mentioned the release of Streamlined Guidance earlier in the fiscal year, and that was met with some confusion and some concerns. So DSPs and then DSP projects. States are not required to conduct DSP projects, and MLRA offices are required to conduct DSP projects. So why does this matter? There's confusion on both sides, it seems, about how to work together sometimes. There is a difference between measuring dynamic soil properties and conducting a dynamic soil property project. It's important for staff to understand how DSP project data will feed conservation planning. The broad operational purpose and the soil survey goal is the development of a national data set composed of ranges of DSPs for different soils under different management scenarios. All staff should understand and be able to explain this confidently to states and partners because it's an important point. But the practical purpose is to assist states with soil health and function goals. So there's a big, really big picture goal, and then there are smaller short-term goals. So this means a full-fledged DSP project does more than measure a few dynamic soil properties. Some states have raised concerns about the requirements for DSP projects, and most of these concerns relate to the most rigorous data collection tier, the intensive data collection tier. We're not going to discuss the details of those during this webinar, but there are different levels. The fact that some past and current studies do not meet the requirements for a true project does not mean the data they collect isn't useful. All data is useful in some way, and it doesn't mean that the MLRA Soil Survey Office can't help the state with their efforts. It simply means that the Survey Office will have to assist the states under the guise of technical soil services, or the Survey Office can take the state effort and expand it into a full-fledged DSP project. And this, of course, would be my recommendation because I'd rather kill two birds with one stone instead of multiple stones. So remember, one state's goals may not align with the goals of soil survey, and staff needs to understand and be equipped to communicate this, but it is in the best interest of states to support DSP projects because it's that project data that can contribute to the national data set needed to predict those potential ranges of dynamic soil properties of different soils with different management systems and land uses. It is these ranges, which are based on robust data collection, that will be used in conservation planning. Before we move on, I have another poll question, and Sean, I will ask you, I cannot see the Adobe Connect window. Would you drag question 4 over to where people can see it, please? So if you all would take us just a few moments and select the answer that best reflects your responsibility related to soil health activities. All right. So now we'll kind of move on to the soil survey advertisement section of the webinar. Soil survey was never intended for site-specific use. Rather, it was created to inventory national soil resources for use as a broad land use planning tool. And I don't usually like to just really read slides, but I think this one deserves it. This is the definition and description of soil survey as defined in the Soil Survey Manual, which was last published in 2017. So a soil survey describes the characteristics of the soil in a given area, classifies the soils according to a standard system of taxonomy, plots the boundaries of the soils on a map, stores soil property information in an organized database, and makes predictions about the suitability and limitations of each soil for multiple uses, as well as their likely response to management systems. The information collected in a soil survey helps the development of land use plans and can be used to evaluate and predict the effects of land use on the environment. It's a beautiful statement. But as our technology has advanced, so have our expectations of existing information. I often clarify the appropriate use of our current maps to our customers. Many want to use soil survey maps and data for site-specific evaluations, but that simply isn't the purpose for which they were created. The NASIS database, or the National Soils Information System, which I understand is the largest natural resource database in the world, provides basic predictive data, but is dominantly inherent property-based. And while this is a strength, it's also somewhat of a limitation. But the addition of DSP data will bolster the utility of soil survey by adding a layer of refined information. Soil survey is a national database tied to the landscape. So here's the Surgo availability map. As you can see, a vast majority of the country has both spatial and tabular data. Some of these incomplete areas that are the light green actually do have correlated soil surveys, and they are presently marked incomplete because there were areas of federal land not surveyed during initial soil survey production. At least that's the case of these areas in Georgia. There's a military installation and wilderness area, and both of those are either being mapped or planned to be mapped in the now. And that they generally do not correspond to private working lands, I don't think. So the strength of dynamic soil properties, and there are a few. One strength of DSPs is they're tied to the inherent properties on which soil survey maps are based. In-field soil verification and laboratory analysis are part of DSP projects. Essentially, these project results can provide quantitative data to bolster and better inform soil health recommendations. Inherent soil properties influence the potential a certain soil can achieve. And just some illustrations so that we can all remember that not all soils are agriculturally equal. On the left, you've got a nice dark mollisol. In the center, you've got a coastal plain quartzy sandent. That's what I'm more familiar with. And then on the right-hand side, you've got a shallow soil in the ridge and valley. And this will never be this, at least certainly not on the human time scale. Little soil scientist humor. Quantification of qualitative soil health measurements provides a more science-based prescription for land use decisions, and a robust data set can be extrapolated nationally, providing ranges of values of DSPs for specific soils under specific management systems. And this allows us to assess the potential of a particular soil, which is something our standard interpretations just do not accomplish. For instance, comparing the potential of soils under conventional tillage with no soil health management systems to the same soil under conservation tillage with some sort of soil health management system, such as crop rotation optimization, cover crops, buffer strips, etc. Those are the types of projects that would really be helpful. We mentioned a couple of databases. Initial funding for a DSP data hub and associated data was approved in August of 2020. And I'll mention that Francine Laritier, who completed a DSP detail before I finished mine, focused on this effort. And the idea is this hub will connect DSP and soil health data from multiple sources. And the amount of funding is just a start, but it's an exciting effort with lots of potential to serve multiple stakeholders. And I like to consider myself a good collaborator, so I'm just going to point out the collaboration with the Soil Health Division and Science and Technology. Those are imperative for the success of this data hub. And when it comes down to it, in some instances, we are asking producers to change their land management. I grew up on a dairy farm, and my father grew much of the forage for the herd. He wasn't one of those guys that bought everything. It was a pretty sustainable kind of operation. So any sort of change in management was thoroughly researched, with the most influential factors being the bottom line and then being a good steward. And he always wanted to know what the ultimate economic return of this change would be. He had to know that before moving forward. There was that delicate balance between being a good steward and having a profitable operation. So these data have the potential to be linked to economic benefits. And some states are interested in and are pursuing this idea. And the purpose is to ultimately increase adoption of soil health management systems, thus improving soil function and improving the farmer's bottom line. Of course, this effort does require collaboration with the economic side of things, but there are entities who have developed or are developing tools to assess cost benefits. One in particular is the American Farmland Trust tool, quantifying the economic and environmental benefits of soil health, and this was funded by an NRCS CIG. I saw this tool demonstrated during the virtual Soil and Water Conservation Society meeting in July, so that is, there are probably many others, but that's one of which I'm aware that has been deployed. also has a large management questionnaire related to it too. So now that the links between DSPs and soil health have been outlined and the DSP application to the National Soil Health Effort supported, you must be wondering, okay, that sounds good, so let's do it. What's the problem, if there are any? Well, prior to this detail, I had the same thought. After some time, it seemed that there was quite simply a lack of awareness of DSP projects and how they can support the soil health effort. So I knew we had to advertise the possibilities to state leadership. So prior to the development of this webinar, I contacted state staff involved in soil health efforts. And to those of you who participated in any of those meetings with me, if you're on the call, thank you very much. I met with staff representing over 80% of states and territories across the nation. So I appreciate that response to a very simple email. I also would like to mention here that this is the first year that MLRA offices have been required to do DSP projects, so it's new for them too, and they're kind of finding their way, so to speak. They haven't, some of them I'm sure are experts, but some of the ones that I deal with, it's a very new process for them. So many of the next steps are things that were discussed during the conversations that I had with state staff. And the next slides are very brief and do not outline detailed solutions, but they are issues for consideration, discussion, and strategy development. Time is something I think we can all agree is a limiting factor for such an effort. One project per year is a piecemeal approach. Developing a strategy to cover more ground with fewer projects, perhaps by targeting benchmark soils or those of agricultural significance, would help this issue. The time to obtain results from soil health management systems is an issue as well. It takes time to document changes on one field. To obtain statistically significant impacts of management across a large geographic area takes even longer. And again, we can provide the quick in-field assessments to producers quickly. There are DSP project types that can help mitigate these shortcomings as well. Repeated measures projects, it's a type of conservation practice evaluation, track impacts of management over the contract length or longer if that works for the producer. Some states commented that contract length impedes good assessment because it takes longer than 3 years for some of these properties to stabilize and actually show any profitability. So that's also an issue, contract length. Soil change studies evaluate management systems by using a space for time substitution design. So that's another way to get around the time it takes to observe the results from soil health management. And laboratory workload. The Kellogg Soil Survey Lab processes samples as quickly as possible, but it takes time, especially when samples are coming in from across the nation. Lucky for us, DSP projects also include those in-field assessments like infiltration and aggregate stability and allow for soil health indicators to be described, which allows for that quicker basic information sharing with landowners and conservation staff while that larger data set is being built. And lastly, patience is a virtue, but it is hard to come by. Soil survey has been in existence for over 120 years. Understanding and quantifying the impacts of improved management systems on working lands takes time too. It's not a short-term endeavor, it's a long-term endeavor. So patience is required. And we are all tasked with doing more with less. MLRA soil survey offices are understaffed. I know of a lot of them that are one-person offices. One person tasked to cover millions of acres that's a pretty big job. Field office staff, we know, are stretched really thin, and state office staff are pulled in multiple directions. Everyone is fully employed, an old supervisor used to say. Imperative to this effort is effective communication. Everyone involved in conservation, the survey offices, the state soil staff, state technical specialists, cooperators, soil health division, science and technology staff, Collaboration on a common goal, soil health and DSPs, increases overall efficiency. So if we had a one-person soil survey office plus one state sponsor, and DSP projects are required to have a state sponsor, plus one field office staff or one resource soil scientist, that is a good number that could be your DSP soil health team or a state soil health specialist if you happen to have those in your area. Additionally, survey offices can maximize progress by integrating DSP projects into other project types as work continues with ecological sites, and then as the survey offices continue refining soil information through their MLRA projects, DSP projects can be integrated into those. Some offices are doing that successfully, I believe. And the agency can increase career development opportunities for field office staff, especially new hires using this approach. Soil and Plant Science Division employees could gain better understanding about where their work fits into conservation planning, and conservation staff can gain a better understanding of basic soils. Next is the issue of funding. It is widely recognized that biological measurements are important indicators of soil health and function. Some of these analyses were those described in the Soil Health Tech Note mentioned earlier in the webinar. However, these analyses are not performed by KSSL and must be paid for either by state or regional budgets. There is not a centralized soil biology lab like KSSL, but there are some secondary labs. Recently, and that was a question that came from a lot of the state conversations I had, were, okay, we need the biological measurements. Who's going to pay for that? But recently, there have been some advancements on the soil health front that may help ameliorate some of the funding issues. You have the soil health management plans that are an option for planners, soil carbon amendment, and then you have the soil testing standard, which is a quantitative analysis of the physical, biological, or chemical characteristics of soil using approved laboratory methods. Soil test results are used in conservation practice implementation to address the resource concern. So producers interested in this standard are prime candidates for DSP projects. It just requires communication between the MLRA survey office and the state, the field office staff, the program staff, whomever. Soil health funding has increased in recent years as well. However, not all cooperators from all parts of the country are engaged. Another idea from those state conversations is to equally fund land-grant National Cooperative Soil Survey cooperators to conduct full DSP projects that contribute valuable and robust scientific data to the soil health effort and work towards building that national data set that I've mentioned several times. And then communication. Everyone knows it is so important, but I think everybody is guilty of not communicating enough or effectively. All the little pieces really do fit together, and I can't emphasize enough the need for staff from different disciplines and divisions to communicate. We all work toward the common goal of soil conservation and can best serve our customers when we are all on the same page. This means staff from the MLRA offices and regions, state soil staff, state technical specialists, soil health division staff, science and technology staff, and cooperators better understand the work of the other. When we understand our own workload and communicate details to colleagues, effective collaboration can ensue. So products developed will be more robust, customer service is improved, and conservation solutions are delivered. So this is a little shorter than it generally is. I tend to talk a little bit faster when I give a presentation. But I hope I've effectively communicated how DSP projects support the overall agency soil health priority. The ultimate goal of predicting the potential range of dynamic soil properties on our nation's working lands is worthy of agency time and resources. Through continued communication, states, Soil and Plant Science Division, S&T, Soil Health Division, all entities can understand needs and expectations for continued progress. Continued communication leads to continued collaboration among staff of different disciplines, each bringing unique expertise and providing opportunity for learning. Continued collaboration moves toward the goal, which deserves continued consideration, to deliver conservation solutions so agricultural producers can protect natural resources and feed a growing world. And before we take questions, although I see here from Jen that she is answering questions as I speak and wrap up. I'd like to mention the DSP Focus Team. Jennifer Mason is MLRA Soil Survey Office Leader in Clinton, Tennessee, and she recently took on leading this focus team, and she would welcome participation from diverse staff. If any of you affiliated with the state have an interest, you'd be welcome to participate. You provide a unique perspective that is probably needed. The focus team has several sub-teams: the Soil Survey Coordination Sub-Team, Soil Biology and DSP Methods, and DSPs for Conservation Planning and TSS. Work is underway to update existing and develop new fact sheets and information for customers and staff. And I have listed Jen's email address on this slide and the link to the DSP Focus Team website. That Focus Team website also comes up quickly just by Googling DSP Focus Team NRCS. This effort would not be complete without acknowledging people who asked questions, provided guidance, and reviewed ideas included in this webinar. These quote-unquote influencers reflect a diverse set of expertise which is needed to advance the Soil Health Agency's priority. So thanks to everybody that ever listened to a question I asked or reviewed something I wrote. Thank you for your time and attention. And if there are any questions that Jen and Sky have not answered, Sky Wills is the National Leader for Research with the Soil and Plant Science Division, and she's a real DSP expert. So between all three of us, Jen and Sky and me, we'll get your questions answered. But other than that, thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it. And always, you know, if you ever have any questions or issues, just I'm easy to find.
Dee, thanks so much. I really appreciate it. I know we all appreciate the time and the effort that you put in, and with your detail, but not just that, Dee always volunteers for committees in the National Cooperative Survey regional meetings. We can't appreciate Dee enough. There is one question, if everyone can hear me. If you can't, let me know. Brian asked, if data collection, measurement, and interpretation are not the same, what are we measuring? And we kind of chatted back and forth with this a little bit. All soil has different collection, management, and interpretation. We measure all of this, and a lot of times with DSPs, hopefully the customer will drive what we're measuring and the questions that they'll answer, if it's our farmer or if it's a district conservationist working with the farmer, the state soil health specialist, the state soil scientist, the state agronomist. It may be someone from the soil health division. You know, it kind of depends on, you know, what questions are we trying to answer in this effort, and hopefully those will be a wide variety of questions. This is, in my opinion, an excellent opportunity to drive us in the customer service realm. You know, most of us grew up a lot of us grew up in the farming world, Dee, Sky, myself, and when I, you know, talk to these farmers, it's like, what questions do you have? And maybe they didn't really think about some things when you open up that conversation, but we do collect, you know, the data and management and interpretation are different for all of these. So a lot of that may depend upon what the customer is trying to achieve.
So Jen, this is Sky. I would just add on to that part of the whole point of the DSP projects and how all of the guidance is laid out is it's just a continuation of soil survey. We're just adding in another dimension. it's not, I mean, it might be new types of data or new ways of organizing it we're not used to, but it isn't any different than collecting data for multiple purposes that we would normally do, right? If you are looking at colors and depth, you're using that as an interpretation of the properties or inferring the properties in the soil. And you might be doing transects where you're trying to differentiate landscape positions or figure out which components go where. But we're also having you record that data and put it in NRCS, and we might want to look at it at a really broad national or state level scope too. So it's not any different than how we always do soil survey. We are always working at multiple purposes. Not all soils are the same. We don't collect the same data everywhere, but we do have some standards that we apply everywhere, and we're trying to move in that same direction for dynamic soil properties. And I think the work that Dee is talking about here and Francine talked about a month or so ago is those are steps along the way. And the more we do, the more we'll know, and we'll get better and better at this. But we have to get started. So does anybody else have any questions? You guys have been pretty quiet in the Q&A today.
Thank you very much, Scott.
Well, Chad had put into the chat for clarification about what MLRA offices doing update work are required to do and what MLRA offices doing initial soil survey work are required to do. So I don't know if you want to summarize that again for people.
Sure, I can summarize pretty quickly that people doing initial soil survey are required to do the extensive tier of DSP data collection, and that is primarily focused on getting earth cover kind 1 and 2 populated and making sure you have things like structure and porosity and roots well populated as you collect data. When you are doing update activities, then all MLRAs that are doing that only with no initial are expected to do a DSP project. And that is at the intermediate or intensive tier, which Francine covered well in her last presentation, and that's what the guidance you referred to is. If you don't know where to find that guidance, email any of us or your regional director, and they should be able to point you to it.
Yeah.
All right, Dee, we had this question earlier, and I'll go ahead and broadcast those results if you want to sort of summarize those responses about people's involvement with soil health activities.
Sure. A little over 50% are somewhat involved. About a quarter of you are very involved. About 20% aren't involved, and just a small 5% of you say that it's not applicable to your current position. So hopefully when you answer question 5, we'll see some results that hopefully your awareness has been increased a little bit. Those are pretty clean breaks with the with that particular question. It's always nice.
Yeah, about 3/4 somewhat to very involved, so that's good.
Yeah.
So Harper has a question in the Q&A. I think it's a question, if not a comment. One of our presenters want to tackle that one?
And Harper, you're right. That's a tough one in the East. You know, in the drop-down menu, you're correct. That is one that just doesn't seem, and Sky, help, you know, you can chime in right here. In the eastern United States, that is a difficult one to populate per diem in the East.
Yeah, and populating it is very difficult, but making observations is the initial step in getting this better documented. And if you, I mean, that's actually a really good point, like how we capture this and how it's reported, it still needs work. So when you're in update mode during intermediate and intensive projects, there is I'm trying to remember what it's called, but there's a management questionnaire that's written to cover all land uses and give us a little bit more information so that it's more specific and more helpful. And these are really focused initially, right now, it's really focused on observation. Like where you're making an observation and collecting data, we want to know what was going on where you collected the data. We are going to have to talk through how to populate and summarize that information for users.
So several people are saying, what's the question? If you could kind of recap the question. So put it in context for folks.
I'm sorry about that. So the question was, cover kind is a multi-cover kind per component per DMU in the East. And that was something Harper put in. And I, just to differentiate, when I'm talking about cover kind for extensive, we're really talking about for observations and data collection and less so for the population of data map unit.
Sorry about that. I thought the Q&A could be seen by everyone. I was trying to move that over and it wouldn't move. So apology for that.
So I would be interested, Jen, Brian says, how do you make a recommendation if definition changes based on what someone wants? And I guess I'm not exactly sure what he's referring to there, because I wouldn't say any definitions change on what someone wants. I would say the way we collect the data and the way we answer the question changes on what someone wants. The underlying information and data is data, and it's more a matter of organization and formatting it to answer the question that's been asked. And so that might be something we need to work on clarifying our language so that we're all sure we're talking about the same thing. So if you have some ideas on how we should do that, you should let Jen know.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if there's maybe a discussion on potentials right there that we may have later on. So just let me know and we can work this out. But it's like what I said earlier, and what Scott just reflected on what I said as far as tailoring this to the customer. But your standards are there, which are National Cooperative Soil Survey standards set forth in our sampling in the Kellogg lab, and et cetera, et cetera. So.
Yeah, I was wondering if Brian's question was related more to different soil potentials, if that was where he was coming from with that question. It may be, and part of the way we're thinking of it, and actually I'm trying to work on something related to this right now, and that is, it's the idea that there's a reference condition for dynamic soil properties, just like there's a reference condition for ecological sites and vegetation dynamics. There's things that are possible and things that are expected, and eventually we will be able to have a pretty good idea what those reference conditions are for every soil, and it just becomes an inherent part of the soil, whereas the actual measured dynamic soil property is going to be dependent on the land use and management that has been in that particular location for a while. So it's a little bit of a conceptual difference, and maybe it's something we need to talk about. I think, I'm trying to remember where the best conversation about that is, but I think that's going to be, it's tricky to talk about, right? Because we don't want to compare mollisols to ultisols. We want to compare an ultisol to an ultisol and a mollisol to a mollisol. But at the same time, there's a lot of different kinds of soils, and it gets pretty overwhelming to describe it all at the same time.
All right, well, it looks like we've pretty well exhausted our questions, so let's move on and give everybody a chance to answer this final question that we've got up here for everyone. I want to thank all of you for your time and effort to make this presentation, and thanks to all the participants for joining in. The on-demand recording of this webinar will be available on our YouTube channel along with over 200 webinars and training videos. Simply search for NRCS, NSSC, or this topic in YouTube, and you'll find the recordings. Feel free to let your colleagues within and outside of NRCS know about this training opportunity, and this will conclude our webinar presentation.